You are talking right now, inside your head, I mean. You are hearing these words in a voice, probably your own, and you are converting symbols on a screen into meaning without even trying. You did not decide to do this. You cannot stop doing it. Even if you tried to silence the voice in your head right now, you would need language to tell yourself to be quiet. That is how deep this thing goes. Language is the one technology you use every waking second of your life, and you have absolutely no memory of learning it. No one sat you down with a textbook. No one explained grammar to you before you could walk. You just absorbed it, the way your lungs absorbed air, automatically, inevitably, as though your brain was built for it. And the thing is, it was. But here's the question nobody can fully answer. How? How did a species of primate living on the African savanna, grunting and gesturing and picking bugs off each other's backs, end up with the ability to write poetry, argue about politics, and lie convincingly to their mothers? How did we go from no language at all to roughly 7,170 languages spoken on this planet right now? The answer involves a banned topic, a gene named after a fox, a cave full of scratched rocks, a bonobo who understands English, and a group of deaf children in Nicaragua who accidentally proved something about the human brain that scientists had been arguing about for a century. So where do we even start? Here is a good place to start. In 1866, the Société de Linguistique de Paris, the most prestigious linguistic society in the world at the time, passed a rule. They banned all papers on the origin of language. Banned them. Not discouraged. Not deprioritized. Banned. The London Philological Society did the same thing 6 years later. The reason was simple. Every theory about where language came from was, at the time, pure speculation. No fossils, no recordings, no way to test any of it. Linguists called the competing theories by dismissive nicknames. The bow wow theory said language started by imitating animal sounds. The poo-poo theory said it started from emotional grunts and cries. The ding-dong theory said words naturally matched the things they described, like a bell matching its ring. All of them were clever. None of them were provable. And serious linguists were tired of watching their discipline get turned into a parlor game. So they locked the door. For over 100 years, the question of how language began was considered scientifically untouchable. Asking it was a career risk. And then, in the late 20th century, 3 separate fields broke the door open at the same time. Genetics, neuroscience, archaeology. And suddenly, the question nobody was allowed to ask became the question everybody wanted to answer. Let's start with the body, because before you can speak, you need the equipment. Look at your throat right now. Swallow. Feel that thing move up and down? That is your larynx, your voice box. In most mammals, the larynx sits high in the throat close to the nasal passages. This is actually useful. It means an animal can breathe and swallow at the same time without choking. Dogs can do it, cats can do it, babies can do it for the first few months of life. But at some point during human evolution, the larynx dropped. It descended lower in the throat, creating a much larger resonating chamber above it, the pharynx. That expanded space is what gives humans the ability to produce the enormous range of vowel and consonant sounds that language requires. No other primate has this, but that descended larynx came with a cost. Humans are the only primate that can choke to death on food. We literally traded the ability to eat and breathe simultaneously for the ability to talk. Philip Lieberman at Brown University spent decades studying this trade-off, and his conclusion was blunt. The descended larynx only makes sense if whatever it enabled, speech, was so beneficial to survival that it was worth the risk of choking every time you ate dinner. But a low larynx is not enough. You also need a hyoid bone. This is a tiny, horseshoe-shaped bone in your throat, the only bone in the human body that does not articulate with any other bone. It just floats there, anchored by muscles and ligaments, and it serves as the attachment point for the tongue muscles that make speech possible. Without it, you cannot form words, and this is where a skeleton in a cave in Israel enters the story. In 1983, archaeologists excavated a Neanderthal skeleton from Kebara cave in northern Israel. They nicknamed him Moshe. He was roughly 60,000 years old, and when they examined his throat, they found a hyoid bone. The discovery was described in 1989, and the finding was immediately controversial. because the bone was virtually identical to a modern human hyoid. Same shape, same size, same proportional dimensions, which meant that Neanderthals, our closest evolutionary cousins, had at least the mechanical hardware for speech. In 2013, a team led by Ruggero D'Anastasio went further. They performed micro-CT scans of the Kebara hyoid and analyzed its internal bone structure, the trabecular architecture. Because internal bone remodels throughout a lifetime in response to physical stress, the pattern of wear tells you how the bone was actually used. The Neanderthal hyoid showed stress patterns consistent with the forces generated during human speech. Not identical necessarily, but consistent. That 60,000-year-old bone was being used in a way that looked a lot like talking. Now, here is where it gets complicated. Having the hardware does not mean you have the software. Your brain has two areas that are specifically associated with language. Broca's area, in the left frontal lobe, handles speech production and the processing of grammar, the structure of sentences. Wernicke's area, further back in the left temporal lobe, handles language comprehension, the understanding of meaning. Damage Broca's area, and a person can understand language perfectly, but cannot produce fluent speech. They know what they want to say, they just cannot get it out. Damage Wernicke's area, and a person can speak fluently and grammatically, producing sentences that sound perfectly normal, except the words are wrong. They talk beautifully and say nothing. These two regions are connected by a bundle of nerve fibers called the arcuate fasciculus, and the whole system is heavily lateralized to the left hemisphere in most people. Other primates have brain regions in roughly the same locations, but they are smaller, less specialized, and not wired together in the same way. The human language circuit is not just a scaled-up version of what a chimpanzee has. It is reorganized. But the discovery that changed everything, the one that cracked the genetics of language wide open, happened because of a single family in London. They are known in the scientific literature only as the KE family. Across 3 generations, about half of the family members suffered from a severe speech and language disorder. They could not coordinate the complex mouth and face movements needed for clear speech. They also had difficulty understanding grammar, particularly complex sentence structures. The disorder was clearly inherited, passed down in a pattern that suggested a single gene was responsible. In 2001, Simon Fisher and Cecilia Lai, working in Anthony Monaco's lab at the University of Oxford, identified the gene. They called it FOXP2, a transcription factor on chromosome 7. A single-point mutation in this gene was responsible for the KE family's disorder. Think about what that means. A single gene, when broken, could disrupt the ability to speak and understand grammar. That does not mean FOXP2 is the language gene. That is a simplification the press ran with and that Fisher himself has spent years correcting. FOXP2 is a regulatory gene. It controls the expression of hundreds of other genes, many of which are involved in building the neural circuits that connect the basal ganglia and the cortex, the motor pathways you need for the precise, rapid mouth and tongue movements that speech requires. It is not the blueprint for language. It is more like the foreman on the construction site, making sure the right circuits get built in the right places during brain development. And here is the part that connects this gene directly to the story of language evolution. In 2002, Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology extracted DNA from Neanderthal fossils and found that Neanderthals carried the same modern human variant of FOXP2. The specific mutations that distinguish human FOXP2 from chimpanzee FOXP2 were already present in the common ancestor of humans and Neanderthals, roughly 500,000 to 600,000 years ago, which means that whatever FOXP2 does for speech, it was already doing it 500,000 years before anyone carved a word into clay. So the body was ready. The brain was wiring itself up. The genes were in place. But when did actual language appear? This is where the archaeological evidence steps in. And the answer it gives is frustrating because language does not fossilize. Words do not leave bones. Sentences do not leave traces in sediment. What fossilizes is symbolic thinking, the ability to use one thing to represent another. And symbolic thinking is the cognitive foundation that language is built on. If you can understand that a red line scratched into a piece of rock means something beyond a red line scratched into a piece of rock, you have the mental architecture for language. Christopher Henschelwood, an archaeologist at the University of Bergen, has spent decades excavating Blombos Cave in the Western Cape of South Africa. What he found there pushed the timeline for symbolic thinking back further than anyone expected. Pieces of ochre deliberately engraved with geometric cross-hatched patterns dating to roughly 75,000 to 100,000 years ago. Deliberately perforated shell beads, the kind you string on a cord and wear as a necklace, dating to a similar period. In 2018, his team published the discovery of a cross-hatched pattern drawn with an ochre crayon on a silkrete flake, dated to approximately 73,000 years ago. That is the oldest known drawing by Homo sapiens. Not a random scribble. A deliberate pattern repeated on multiple objects, in multiple layers of the cave, across thousands of years. Someone was making marks that meant something, and if those marks meant something to the person who made them, and if other people understood what they meant, that is a communication system. That is the beginning of a language. But you do not need caves or beads to find evidence of language. You need tools. Dietrich Stout, an archaeologist at Emory University, did something clever. He put people inside fMRI scanners and had them watch videos of someone knapping stone tools, the ancient technique of chipping flint into a sharp edge. He wanted to see which parts of the brain activated when people observed and practiced tool making. The result was striking. Making simple Oldowan tools, the kind Homo habilis used 2.5 million years ago, lit up basic motor areas. But making complex Acheulean hand axes, the kind Homo erectus refined over hundreds of thousands of years, activated the ventral premotor cortex, a region that sits right inside Broca's area, the same part of the brain responsible for language production and syntactic processing. The more complex the tool, the more the brain relied on the same circuitry it uses for language. Think about what that implies. Building a complex stone tool requires you to hold a multi-step plan in your head, execute actions in a specific hierarchical sequence, and correct errors in real time. Building a sentence requires exactly the same cognitive operations. Plan, sequence, correct. The brain used the same hardware for both, which means that the evolutionary pressure to make better tools may have been the same pressure that pushed the brain toward language. You did not get language because you needed to chat. You got language because you needed to teach, because you needed to tell someone, not that rock, this rock, hit it here, harder, no, angle it like this. And that kind of instruction requires words. And here is a connection that most people miss entirely. Fire, not just as a survival tool, as a language incubator. Richard Wrangham, a biological anthropologist at Harvard, argued in his 2009 book, Catching Fire, that the control of fire and the invention of cooking, which he dates to roughly 1.8 million years ago with Homo erectus, fundamentally restructured human social life. Cooking made food easier to digest, which freed up enormous amounts of metabolic energy the body redirected to growing a larger, more complex brain. But cooking also created something new in the daily routine. Downtime. When you eat raw food, you chew for hours, the way chimpanzees do. When you eat cooked food, the meal is over in minutes. That leaves time. And what do you do with that time? You sit around the fire. In 2014, anthropologist Polly Weissner at the University of Utah published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences analyzing hundreds of hours of conversations among the Jukwa-Hwansi San people of the Kalahari Desert. She compared what people talked about during the day with what they talked about at night, around the fire. The results were striking. Daytime conversations were overwhelmingly practical. Who hunts where? What needs fixing? Complaints, negotiations, resource management. But at night, around the fire, the content shifted. 81% of firelight conversations were stories. Myths, legends, accounts of people who lived far away or long ago. Firelight was when humans told each other about things that were not there. Displacement, the defining feature of human language. Weissner's conclusion was that the firelight environment, safe, social, relaxed, may have been the evolutionary context in which the most complex features of human language developed. Not during the hunt, not during a fight, during the story hour that only fire made possible. And there is something else the fire data points to that connects directly to how language works: teaching. Around a fire, someone can demonstrate a technique, explain a strategy, and narrate the steps of a process while the audience watches the glow and listens. Teaching is a verbal act. It requires you to describe something your listener cannot see, to explain a sequence of actions that have not happened yet, to correct errors that exist only in someone else's understanding. Teaching by its nature demands language. And the longer humans sat around fires, the more they taught, the more language had to grow to accommodate the complexity of what was being taught. Fire did not invent language, but fire may have been the incubator where simple communication turned into something infinitely more complex. Now, all of this evidence, the tools, the fire, the brain regions, the genes, the symbolic artifacts, points to a gradual, incremental process stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, possibly millions. But there is a problem with that story, because somewhere around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, something changed. And it changed fast. Archaeologists call it the Great Leap Forward, though that label has fallen out of favor because leap implies something sudden, and the reality is messier. Around this period, the archaeological record explodes with evidence of behavioral modernity. Sophisticated stone tools, bone tools, fishing hooks, musical instruments, including bone flutes from caves in Germany dating to roughly 40,000 years ago. Cave paintings on the walls of Sulawesi in Indonesia, now dated to at least 51,200 years old, the oldest narrative art in the world. Long-distance trade networks moving obsidian, and shells hundreds of kilometers. Burial practices involving ochre and grave goods, art, music, ritual, trade, all of it appearing in the archaeological record in a relatively compressed window. Some researchers, most notably Noam Chomsky, argued that this explosion was triggered by a single genetic event, a mutation that gave humans the capacity for recursion, the ability to embed one phrase inside another, which is the structural backbone of human grammar. The man who wore the hat that I saw yesterday at the store told me something interesting. That sentence has phrases nested inside phrases, and you followed it without effort. Chomsky argued this ability appeared abruptly, perhaps in a single individual, and spread rapidly because the advantage it conferred was so overwhelming. Language, in Chomsky's view, is not a gradual adaptation. It is a discrete faculty, a mental organ that either exists or does not, and it switched on in our species relatively recently. Daniel Everett, a linguist at Bentley University, spent 30 years living with the Piraha people of the Amazon basin, and what he found there directly challenged Chomsky's framework. The Piraha language has no recursion, no embedded clauses, no numbers beyond 1 and 2, no creation myths, no distant past tense. It operates almost entirely in the immediate present. Everett argued that this disproves the idea of a universal grammar hardwired into the brain. Language, he insisted, is a cultural tool, shaped by the needs and values of the community that uses it. If the Piraha do not need numbers or embedded clauses, their language does not develop them. Language is not an instinct, it is an invention, one that different cultures have invented differently. The debate between Chomsky and Everett is one of the most contentious in modern linguistics, and it is still unresolved. But their disagreement is only one layer of a much larger argument, because the question is not just when language appeared, it is how. What was the mechanism? What was the pressure? What problem did language solve that grunting and pointing could not? And there are competing answers, each one supported by a different slice of evidence. Robin Dunbar, an evolutionary psychologist at Oxford, published a book in 1996 called Grooming, Gossip, and the Evolution of Language. His argument is elegant. In primate societies, physical grooming, picking through each other's fur, is how individuals build and maintain social bonds. But grooming is one-on-one. It takes time. And there is a limit to how many relationships you can maintain by grooming alone. Dunbar calculated that limit by looking at the correlation between primate brain size and social group size. For humans, the limit is roughly 150 individuals, a number that keeps showing up in military units, church congregations, and Facebook friend lists. His argument is that as human groups grew larger than grooming could manage, language evolved as a more efficient form of social bonding. You can groom one person at a time, you can gossip with five. Language, in Dunbar's theory, is essentially vocal grooming, and the first conversations were probably gossip. Who did what to whom? Who can be trusted? Who is sleeping with whose partner? The content of most human conversation today, if you actually track it, is still about other people and their behavior. We have been gossips from the beginning. Michael Corballis, a psychologist at the University of Auckland, had a completely different take. He argued that language started not with the voice, but with the hands. His gestural theory proposes that early hominids communicated through manual and facial gestures, a system that gradually incorporated mouth movements and eventually vocalizations. The evidence is real. Apes rely far more on gesture than on vocalization for flexible communication. The brain regions that control hand movements and mouth movements are adjacent and heavily interconnected. And humans still gesture constantly when they speak, even when talking on the phone, when nobody can see them. Corballis believed that speech was the last stage of language, not the first. The first stage was pointing, pantomiming, and waving your hands around until somebody understood you, which, if you have ever tried to communicate in a country where you do not speak the local language, probably sounds familiar. Stephen Mithen, an archaeologist at the University of Reading, took a third route entirely. In his 2005 book, The Singing Neanderthals, he proposed that language and music share a common ancestor, a proto-communication system he called an acronym for holistic, manipulative, multimodal, musical, and mimetic. In this theory, early hominids communicated through rhythmic, melodic vocalizations that conveyed emotion, intention, and social meaning, but did not have individual words. Think of it as singing without lyrics. Music and language, in Mithen's view, eventually split apart. Language taking the road of compositional meaning and music retaining the emotional, rhythmic qualities of the original system. The fact that music can move you to tears without using a single word, and that mothers across every culture on Earth instinctively sing to their infants, is, in Mithen's framework, a behavioral fossil of how we once communicated before words existed. Now here's the pattern interrupt. Forget every theory for a second, because the single most powerful piece of evidence that language is built into the human brain did not come from a fossil, a gene, or an fMRI scanner. It came from a schoolyard in Managua, Nicaragua. In 1977, the Nicaraguan government opened a special education center for deaf children. Before that, there was no established deaf community in the country. Deaf children had grown up isolated, each one using a homemade gesture system called homozyne to communicate with their hearing families. These systems were different for every child. They had no shared grammar, no shared vocabulary, no shared structure. When these children were brought together for the first time, something happened that linguists still consider one of the most remarkable events in the history of language science. The children invented a language, not learned one, invented one. Within a few years, the first cohort had developed a shared communication system, a pidgin of sorts, combining and standardizing elements from their individual homozynes. But it was the second cohort, the younger children who entered the school after the first group, who did something truly extraordinary. They took the rough, unstructured input from the older children and spontaneously imposed grammatical rules on it. Spatial modulation, verb agreement, systematic word order. Features that no one taught them, because no one in the building knew how to teach them, because no one had ever seen the language before. It had never existed. Anne Sengaz, a cognitive scientist now at Columbia University, spent decades studying this community. Her conclusion was direct. The children were not copying language, they were generating it. Their brains were wired to create grammatical structure out of whatever communicative input they received, even if that input was messy, incomplete, and inconsistent. The language, now called Nicaraguan Sign Language, Idioma de Signos Nicaraguense, is a fully complex, fully grammatical human language. It was created from scratch by children in less than a generation. That is not culture. That is biology. That is a brain that builds language the way a spider builds a web because it cannot help it. And this is where we come back to the animals, because the obvious question is why us? Why not chimpanzees? Why not dolphins or crows or elephants? A bonobo named Kanzi, studied for decades by primatologist Sue Savage Rumbaugh, learned to communicate using lexicograms, geometric symbols on a keyboard that each represented a word. He mastered several hundred of them. He could understand spoken English sentences he had never heard before. Things like take the vacuum cleaner outdoors. He could follow instructions that required him to understand word order, distinguishing between carry the ball to the river and carry the river to the ball. That is genuinely impressive. But Kanzi never asked a question. He never told a story about yesterday. He never speculated about what might happen tomorrow. He never used language to talk about language. He operates firmly in the present tense. And that is the gap. Human language has a property called displacement. We can talk about things that are not here, things that happened long ago, things that have not happened yet, things that will never happen, things that do not exist. A chimpanzee can learn the symbol for banana and use it to request a banana. A human can write a poem about a banana that makes you cry. That difference, the ability to detach language from the immediate physical world and use it to construct meaning that exists nowhere except inside someone else's head, is the thing that separates us from every other communicating species on the planet. And nobody knows exactly when it appeared. So how did humans invent language? Here is the honest answer, and here is why the question is so maddeningly difficult. Language was not invented the way the bow was invented, or the boat, or the sword. It was not a single tool, built by a single person in a single place. It was a convergence. A slow, layered, multi-million-year convergence of anatomy, neurology, genetics, social pressure, and cognitive capacity, all of which had to line up before the first meaningful word could be spoken. The probability that language evolved gradually, in stages over hundreds of thousands of years, building on pre-existing primate communication systems and driven by the pressures of social complexity and tool use, is roughly 70 to 75% based on the current weight of evidence. This is the position held by most researchers in the field today, from Dunbar to Stout to Pinker. The alternative, that a single sudden genetic mutation, perhaps 50,000 to 100,000 years ago, flipped a switch and gave humans fully modern language in one step, carries roughly a 20 to 25% probability. This is closer to Chomsky's position, and while it has fewer advocates today, it cannot be fully ruled out because the archaeological record does show a relatively abrupt explosion of symbolic behavior around that time. The remaining 5% accounts for stranger theories, including the possibility that language evolved primarily through gesture and only later moved to speech, or that different components of language evolved at different times through different mechanisms. The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, and we may never know because the event left no direct fossil record. But what we do know is this. The body was ready at least 500,000 years ago, when the hyoid bone and the FOXP2 gene were already in place in the common ancestor of humans and Neanderthals. The brain was building language-compatible circuits for at least 2 million years, driven by the demands of increasingly complex tool-making. Symbolic thinking, the cognitive bedrock of language, was clearly present in Africa by 100,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier. And the human brain, as the children in Managua proved, does not need to be taught language. It generates language the way a heart generates a heartbeat, because that is what it was built to do. Right now, as you read this, roughly 7,170 languages are being spoken on this planet. One of them dies every 40 days. By the end of this century, as many as 90% of them could be gone. And every single one of those languages, from Mandarin to a click language spoken by 200 people in a village in Namibia, traces its ancestry back to the same moment, a moment nobody recorded, when one primate looked at another and made a sound that meant something beyond itself. Not a warning cry. Not a mating call, a word, an arbitrary sound attached to an arbitrary meaning, understood by both the speaker and the listener. The most ordinary thing a human being does. The most extraordinary thing the natural world has ever produced. And you have been doing it since before you could tie your shoes.